Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of LawPod. I'm Dr. Rachel Colleen, a lecturer here in the School of Law, and I'm joined today by Dr. Tanya Cerisier. She's over doing a talk about her new book, which is called Speaking Out, and talks about the political narratives of speaking out against sexual violence. So we thought it'd be nice just to catch up with her and hear a little bit about her book. So hi, Tanya.
Hi, thank you so much.
I wonder if you could just start by just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I am a senior lecturer in criminology at Birkbeck College, which is part of the University of London, and I work there mainly on, I suppose, the cultural politics of sexual violence. So I work on speaking out, but I also work on things like movements around consent and the way that ideas about acceptable and unacceptable sex have changed, particularly in the last kind of 50 to 100 years. And before that, I was actually working here in Queen's in criminology, and originally, as you might be able to tell, I was from Australia, so I did my PhD at Monash University there.
And what was it that originally got you interested then in this speaking out as a response to sexual violence?
Well, it's a very kind of particular but long story. So I finished my undergraduate degree, and I wasn't really sure exactly what I was going to do, and so I was working in the community sector, actually, in women's health and rape crisis centres. And at the time I was living in Sydney, and so this is kind of towards the beginning of the 2000s, and there were some very, very prominent trials there of basically a couple of groups of young men, one group of whom were Lebanese Muslim and one group of whom were predominantly Pakistani Muslim. And it turned into a, I suppose a classic moral panic around kind of an epidemic of Muslim gang rapes going around. And the media and politicians and the police claimed that they were racially targeting young white women. Now, this wasn't true, but it became a big problem, for feminists and for those of us, I suppose, kind of on the progressive end of politics in terms of how to respond. And what frustrated me was that the response from kind of feminist organizations was to try to interject into this narrative and try to say, well, it's not only Muslim men who rape women, all men do. But at the same time, when these trials produced kind of the longest sentence that had ever happened in New South Wales, which is a particular jurisdiction in Australia, for sexual violence, and when the state government brought in a whole raft of new legislation, predominantly which targeted gangs rather than sexual violence. So it increased the sentence for gang rape from 15 years to life, but it also brought in other things like made it possible for police to stop a car if it had 3 or more young people in it, and those kinds of classic anti-gang legislation. So it was very racially motivated and very targeted, and it was all bound up at the time in kind of discourse around terrorism and the war on terror. And so my colleagues and friends were kind of protesting outside the trial in favor of these very long sentences and in favor of speaking out, and it just seemed to me a real kind of failure, I guess, to actually see what the problem was and what was at stake. And it seemed very obvious to me that not only was this, racist, but it wasn't actually going to improve things for, survivors and victims of sexual violence. So that is what brought me back into the academy, I suppose, and what prompted me to start working on the PhD. And so the PhD was really started in terms of kind of what went wrong in this particular instance and thinking about, feminist politics and what kind of sat at the heart of it. And that's where I got interested in the idea of speaking out, and thinking about, okay, this idea that, if women tell their stories of violence, that it's going to lead to these kind of automatic, progressive changes, but seeing these stories being used, because there were very kind of racist and right-wing commentators at the time who were saying that they were the champions of these young women, and they were bringing them forward and retelling and telling their stories, but in order to further a very different agenda. And so that was the impetus and what got me interested in it. And as I kind of looked into it more and more, it just became, I suppose, fascinating to me that it was such an unquestioned kind of center of feminist politics in activism, in academia, everywhere, but no one had done any kind of critical work on it. It just, was this thing that people said, we value the stories of victims and survivors, but weren't actually looking at the effects of those stories culturally and politically, weren't actually looking at the effects of speaking out on individual women, just presuming that it would be empowering. And in a sense, were kind of claiming to take the stories really seriously, but weren't actually engaging with them. So there was this presumption that if you were a survivor and you were telling your story, obviously you would think these particular things, these kinds of feminist assumptions, but actually survivors who speak out have all kinds of different politics and different ideas. And so, so it just opened up this really kind of big area of research. And sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
No, it's fascinating. It was making me think when you were talking as well about what happened here around the trial of the Ulster rugby players, and I was thinking about seeing a feminist space that I associate with being progressive turn punitive, and that connection that can sometimes be made between people that want to advocate for sexual violence survivors and against rape and gender-based violence, how they can sometimes end up aligned with quite right-wing discourses, and how you can push back against that without then sounding like you are, a rape apologist or, saying that it's fine. And it can be very difficult to carve out a space to have those types of conversations and try and broaden it out to, well, this person did a bad thing, but that doesn't mean that necessarily really harsh sentencing or new punitive laws are going to stop the harm that was done to the victim. And actually you've ended up furthering things that actually might not really align with who you are politically, or what's appropriate for a kind of progressive feminist movement. So I see that happening here as well.
I mean, it happens a lot, I think, and it's one of the things that I do talk about in the book, the response to Emily Doe, particularly the survivor of the Stanford swimmer assault, and the way that she tells a story which is actually very critical of the law and legal responses, and it gets taken up, and it goes viral, but the campaigns that arise out of that are all about increasing punitive measures, and that's kind of, and recalling the judge involved in the case, but only because, he didn't give a harsh enough sentence, and not thinking really about the kind of underlying problems around that, or...
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That was fascinating. I wonder then, maybe could you tell us a little bit about what you've already kind of touched on it, but what kind of themes are present in your book and what areas you focus on?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about the actual structure of the book. So what I do in the book is it's in two halves, and the first half is about, I suppose, trying to chart a bit of a history of speaking out. So beginning with the second wave feminist movements and consciousness raising, and the creation of a space for women to speak originally, first within feminist movements, but also with media attention, and then kind of tracing that through the 1980s and early 1990s, where you see those narratives begin to go out into, more kind of commercial and mainstream media spaces. So, newspapers, magazines, talk shows, and that's in some ways a real victory, that's dissemination, but it also brings up more kind of complicating factors, because you find, for instance, survivors on talk shows speaking and telling their stories and seeing them, which relates to what we were talking about before, getting framed in very different ways, and seeing themselves kind of just presented as this kind of spectacle, and then moving forward and thinking about, coming into then the era of social media as well. And then in the second half of the book, I try to unpack some of the political problems that we've been talking about a bit more. So, thinking about the fact that, we tend to presume with speaking out that it's going to do at least three things. It's going to be individually empowering for women. And actually, as I've kind of said, when you look, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's empowering, but it's also an incredibly vulnerable position. And people can feel very much that they get trapped in those stories, that they can only express themselves in a particular way, that, people feel like they know who they are and what's happened to them, and that identity of being a survivor of rape precludes and kind of takes over everything else. So the second thing is, that if individual women speak, it's going to open up a space for other women to speak, and it's going to get rid of all the stigma and shame, and we're going to be able to tell our stories. And so one of the things that I look at is the way that if you think about these stories as stories, and so if you think about them as a genre, a collection of stories, that genre, includes stories, but it also has boundaries and limits and excludes stories as well. So I try to trace the way that particular kinds of stories, remain a lot more tellable than others. And that's about who speaks, and particularly around questions of race and class, that the stories that get told tend to be predominantly stories that have actually always been more tellable in the courts, stories by, middle-class white women of stranger rapes, rather than more complicated stories, rather than stories by women of color, rather than stories, by women who aren't seen to be respectable, and also stories that fit within those kinds of criminal justice narratives. Sorry, I've had a little bit of a cold.
Okay.
And, the third thing, which we've touched on as well, is that telling these stories is going to produce a new, more progressive politics of rape, that's going to shift culture and politics. And so the final thing that I try to look at is the ways in which that doesn't necessarily happen, and the ways in which these kinds of stories, end up coming within, older, powerful narratives around stranger danger, around who we think of as typical criminals, reasserting this idea not that, sexual violence is a problem of the everyday and the normal, but it's a problem of these kinds of deviant strangers who can be dealt with by the criminal law. And so one of the ways that I look at that right at the end of the book is the kind of 2016 election with Donald Trump, and, saying that, when firstly women began to tell their stories about sexual harassment with Trump, I think there was a presumption amongst kind of Democrats and liberals that this was going to be the end of Trump. And actually people took those stories and, they heard and read them in very different ways, depending on their politics. And it goes back, to that original story that I was telling, that kind of prompted my work, is you can hear those stories and think, sexual violence is wrong, or you can hear those stories and you can have, as was in the kind of dominant media discourse at the time, Arab and Muslim men are raping our women, and, and it actually reasserts these kinds of gendered logics. So, so it proceeds through a series of case studies, really.
Wow, it sounds fascinating. I guess just to tease out a couple of the threads in some of the stuff that you were talking about there, for, I suppose, because it's Law Pod and our law students might be listening to this, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your focus on the legal process. So what kinds of opportunities did you see being given to survivors to talk about what happened to them, and what are the limits of a legal response to this type of violence?
The question, I think, of the law is really interesting. And again, it's more complicated than we often give it credit for. So, when early second wave feminists begin to speak about rape and begin to tell their stories, and this remains a theme, one of the things that they're talking about is the denial and dismissal of these stories by the law. And I think those kinds of criticisms of the kind of rape myth that are promoted by law, the low conviction rates, the way that testifying in trial is really traumatizing, we know those kinds of criticisms and critiques, and they're part of it. So part of what feminists do, I think, when they begin to speak publicly and they begin to do things like try to get their stories into mass media, is actually to decenter the law as the only place in which women can tell their stories and get any kind of redress, because it simply wasn't working. And in decentering the law, it's also about disputing the law's right to be the arbiter of these truth claims, actually saying, the law doesn't stand above these stories and judge them neutrally, but the law has this, inherent bias against women's stories. And, it goes back to those very famous, common law quotes from Sir Matthew Hale, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but, that rape is a terrible crime, but it's an allegation easily made and hard to be disproved by the accused party, no matter how innocent they are. And the law is actually, and that being developed into an instruction for juries, telling them to disbelieve women's stories. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that even with that, the law remains probably the primary space for women to tell their stories, have their stories heard, and have them recognized as truth. So there's always been a kind of dual element, I think, to feminist responses to the law, and I think in a way you have to have that, which is to try to decenter it and try just to, point out how terrible an institution it is for judging sexual violence, but then also trying to make women's stories more hearable within it and to have a fair hearing and have women be recognized as truth tellers, rather than as always subject to disbelief and denial and to lies. And so I think one of the things that we don't talk about a lot in feminist discourse is the fact that for some women, testifying at trial, as a result of feminist critiques of law, as a result of feminist law reform, and also as a result of the fact that feminism has given women tools of analysis, for some women testifying at trial can actually be, a very validating and empowering experience. And it comes back to those stories that are tellable. So we're talking predominantly about white women, about middle-class women telling stories of stranger rape. But, if they can mobilize those kinds of narratives, then quite often they can get convictions, and we know that in the legal system, we often talk about rape convictions as though they're all the same, but in fact, rape cases that fit a very traditional kind of archetypal stranger rape narrative don't actually have very different conviction rates from other violent assaults. They're not really the problem. The problem is that the vast majority of cases don't fit that particular narrative. And so for women who are speaking in that way, or who can make their story fit in important ways into that kind of narrative, then the law can be a very useful place. What's troubling, I think, is that often women do have to mobilize really conservative ideas around kind of sexual respectability, even ideas around kind of being able to portray the person who sexually assaulted them as a typical kind of criminal, and they can use them to get a legal victory. And I think you see, really interesting ways that women do that. But the problem is that, within the framework of the laws and within kind of the rules of the contest, that's actually how you get a conviction. You still don't get a conviction simply by asserting, women's right to set their own bodily autonomy, to navigate sex and sexuality on their own terms. That doesn't succeed in law. So then in terms of what kind of room there is for the criminal law, I think, I kind of have it both ways in a sense. I'm personally quite pessimistic or skeptical about it, but at the same time, it is actually the tool that women have to seek not only, redress or vengeance, but, validation, justice, fairness, and those kinds of ideas that Claire McGlynn writes about in terms of, kaleidoscopic justice, that actually if you think about, and again, it's this point of actually if you listen to survivors and you don't presume you already know the meaning of their stories, when people talk about what they want, it's a whole range of things. And actually some people do want, in a very straightforward way, this man who hurt them to suffer, and that's completely understandable. A lot of women, might want that, but actually what might be more important is to have their experience heard, believed, to have a social, a legal, affirmation that what happened to them shouldn't have happened, and that there should be some redress and some balance for that. And they're actually quite different things. But as you were saying, we tend to think they're the same.
Yeah.
And we tend to think, it's only it's the punitive that symbolizes everything else, when that's not necessarily the case. So I think, and there are quite radical ideas for how we might change, courts around sexual violence, whether having specialist courts, whether moving away from ideas of consent to focus more on things like harm and accountability, ideas of restorative justice. I think that there always has to be, a role for law and a role for the criminal law, unless we radically reconfigure that more generally, because that is actually the space we have in our society to tell stories of harm and have them heard and recognized. But decades of law reform hasn't really improved the situation, and so we need to think about it quite differently. And I think potentially thinking about it in terms of not only enabling women to tell their stories, but asking, under what conditions are those stories told, under what conditions are those stories believed, might allow us to begin to unpick it and change it a little bit as well.
Yeah. A couple of things you said there I thought were quite interesting that I wanted to pick up on. First, I'll just say them actually so I don't forget them, and then just talk about. I was thinking about when you mentioned restorative justice, and it's another space that can create quite a lot of tension within, feminist movements because of the, perceived power dynamics and the inappropriateness of that kind of response. And I wondered what your thoughts were about that. And then when you were saying, I really like Claire McGlynn's phrase of kaleidoscopic justice. I think it's brilliant. And I wondered, do you get a sense that even though you were saying, some survivors want the punitive, others might want a range of other things, is there pressure within kind of feminist movements for it to be the former, or like an assumption almost that the survivors speaking out should want punitive and that their voice should be used in order to seek that more punitive forms of justice?
I think that's definitely an assumption, and I think it's understandable. And the problem is that, we're so limited in our imagining of what it means to take sexual violence seriously, what it means to respond to it, that, as you said, it's often presented as the only kind of thing, but it doesn't help, for instance, with things like prevention. It operates within a system in which, as we know, the criminal justice system targets, perpetrators very unequally, defines victims very unequally. And so it's a problem to presume that that is the model of justice. And it comes up against questions that, very complicated questions in sexual violence and also in domestic violence cases as well, where, once you accept that a lot of sexual violence actually happens within ongoing relationships in the domestic sphere, that not actually all survivors of violence even want to cut off a relationship with the person who's committed this violence against them. Some of them want to continue even to have a romantic and a sexual relationship. And so that complicates things, a great deal. And I think the problem can be that there is this imperative that if you don't go through the criminal justice system, if you don't report, you're somehow, failing, that you're not actually doing what you should or what you're supposed to do, which I think is really problematic when we know that the criminal justice system actually fails, survivors systematically, and this is, true internationally. I don't think there's, really a single kind of criminal justice system that anyone says is working around sexual violence. And yet, there is this pressure on women to engage with the criminal justice system no matter what. In terms of restorative justice, I think it is a difficult question. And they've done some experiments with restorative justice in Canada, particularly around sexual violence, that have actually gone quite well. But again, I think, it's not something that is going to work for everyone. It is something that when you're thinking about kind of gendered power dynamics, is very difficult. And, I don't think it actually works as a kind of overall solution. Models coming out particularly of the US around transformative justice and how, you imagine accountability amongst people and within communities that is actually social rather than individual. I think given the social nature of sexual violence, the fact that, the problem with it so often is that it's not deemed to be deviant, it's deemed to be kind of normal, or, there's no social agreement on that in like the majority of cases, which is something that comes up in the rugby case as well,
Yeah. And when you mentioned transformative justice there, what would that term involve, or what might that look like?
Well, it looks like a lot of different things, most of which I think are quite experimental, but it comes predominantly out of the work of Black feminists and prison activists and policing activists in the US. And, it's the idea that particularly, if you think about African American communities, that they cannot look to the police, the prisons, the criminal justice system as a whole for justice, in society as it stands. And so it argues that what you want is to go back to what justice means, which is something that we don't often think about. In the criminal justice system, it's a term that we kind of just take for granted. And they say, what justice means is, healing and recognition for victims of harm. It means accountability for perpetrators, but it also means healing, recognition, and accountability for a community and a society that has failed, the people within it. And so it's an idea of justice that operates at a social level in order to change the conditions that enabled that harm to occur in the first place. So where, for instance, restorative justice, might involve bringing a victim and a perpetrator together, potentially with other members of the community, and talking about, how these harms impacted them and how the perpetrator can do something about it. Transformative justice might have elements of that, but would then also be about thinking, well, what in our community needs to change so that if we're talking about sexual violence, that we're not producing young men, older men, who this is how, they relate romantically, sexually to women. What might we change in terms of our education? What might we change in terms of, the way that we talk about sex and sexuality and romance, that actually, and I think that's, to me, what's important. I talked about culture before, that if we only operate at the level of the legal, then we don't engage with those kinds of cultural norms that actually perpetuate, and normalize sexual violence, or normalize, what Nicole Gavey talks about as the cultural scaffolding of rape, things like the idea that, men should pursue sex and women should resist it, all those kinds of things that we sometimes, I think, like to think about are old-fashioned, but are very much still, the underlying foundation of the way we think about sex and relationships. And I think, along with a lot of other people, that in some ways the key to thinking about sexual violence is actually starting to think about sex differently. And by that, I mean thinking about sex more socially, bringing sex and intimacy and relationships, into schools, into educating young people, into social dynamics, more explicitly, because they're always there, but we don't actually give people in our societies tools to communicate around sex, tools to engage ethically around sex, but then we just expect that everyone's going to know when something has gone wrong and what to do about it, and clearly we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important. It's really good how you've identified the limits of the law, which is really important. It's good to critique these things and to point out what's failing, but it can also be difficult to imagine what's not there. And it's, I think you're really highlighting the importance of kind of radical reimaginings, and not just being how can we tweak what we currently have, but maybe taking a step back and being like, well, maybe the entire apparatus is broken. That could be really difficult because, how do you pursue one but also try in the meantime to make what we already have better? There's that tension there as well. And do you grapple a little bit with that in your book?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the book is more about more about the former, kind of thinking, how do we radically reimagine storytelling, narrative, listening and making spaces for survivors and for changing the way that we relate politically and culturally to the problems around sexual violence. It's less particularly about the law and law reform. There is a chapter specifically on law, but, I think it's really, in a sense, this is my PhD supervisor told me this actually, in a sense, you can see law as a spectre behind the whole kind of book, because it's always a spectre when women talk about sexual violence, wherever they are, is, how would this be framed by law? How is this able or not able to be expressed in the criminal justice system? And that's something that I think has become a bit more of an explicit conversation in the aftermath of Me Too. People telling stories that are framed, I think, quite explicitly by the people that tell them as, either this wouldn't be recognized by the law, or I don't know if it would be recognized by the law, which is another thing with sexual violence, that we've had these decades of law reform, and a lot of women have sexual experiences that they don't, they can tell were unwanted or wrong, but they don't know for sure if they were illegal or not, and there's actually a lot of, lack of understanding of the law. And I think that's also an issue, how does the legal actually relate to the social when most people don't know the law explicitly?
I suppose that links back to what you were saying about education as well, because I think of perpetrators, not knowing as well that they've done something illegal, or that they've done something that's necessarily perceived as coercive by the person that experienced it. And I think that can be a troubling reflection, but also is an important one, that it's entirely possible for a person to believe that they were raped and a person to believe genuinely that they did not rape them, because of this, the ambiguity around it, and when does something become coercive. And that's exactly what you were saying, because we don't give young people the tools to know. And narratives like, women resist sex and that's part of the chase and all that. If you have been entrenched in that kind of way of thinking, I can see how it's possible to do something that's coercive and not realise.
Catherine McKinnon wrote about this in 1983, I think, anyway. And she said that it is perfectly possible, for, as you say, a woman to have an experience of coercive sex and a man to have an experience of, normal sex. And she says the problem is that the law historically has always taken the man's point of view, and that there's no room within the law for acknowledging either that that's just a point of view, because what the law does essentially is take a version of events and turn them into the truth, a legal truth. And so in taking the man's point of view, it erases the woman's point of view and makes it illegitimate, invalid. And so can we imagine a situation in which the law no longer does that, but does something else? And
that could be hard to imagine in what we currently have, because you immediately run up against, presumptions of innocence and the rights of the defence. So I suppose it speaks to the difficulties of something that's so interpersonal, something that there's rarely witnesses to, and how can the law hold that nuance while protecting the rights of the accused that we hold very dearly within our legal system. So we circle back round to the limits of the law again.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is, that is a question about the criminal justice system. It is, I actually think necessarily so, a very blunt instrument, and it always will be. And is it capable of providing an ethical framework for our most intimate and personal relationships? And I think clearly no, it's not. Is it necessary to have it as a safeguard around harms that are experienced in those relationships? In the society in which we live as it currently stands, I think yes, it's very difficult to argue against that. But I do think, and this is again comes back, to the question of what we do as, feminists, as people who want to change things, is if we can make the law, I think, a bit less central to our conversations in that sense, and accept that it is an imperfect instrument, because this is the thing that people like Rose Corrigan's written. It's very US focused, but I think a very good book on the feminist law reform project around rape, and she calls it the failures of success. And so she says, we have 50 years of, intense, actually, law reform, cross-jurisdictionally. It's one of the areas that's been most most radically, but also most consistently reformed, since the early 1980s, when you began to see jurisdictions bringing in, much stricter kind of consent requirements and moving away from requirements around resistance and corroboration. But the problem is that there's been all of these kinds of reforms, but the fundamental experience of women at trial, conviction rates, attrition, none of these things have really changed much.
Yeah.
And actually what you see is a system that's kind of self-balancing. So you'll have, for police campaigns around reporting, which we were talking about before, and you see rates of reporting go up, and then correspondingly you see rates of conviction go down. So that in the end, we still end up with cases falling out at different points of the system, but the overarching figures looking kind of depressingly similar. And so for Rose, it is a project that's been successful in terms of getting some of the things that we thought we wanted, but then a failure in terms of it not producing the outcomes that we thought that it would have. And I think if you look more broadly than the law, it's a bit more of a complicated picture, because I think, culturally and socially things have changed, but then in important ways, those changes again haven't had the outcomes that we've thought that they would have in terms of preventing or reducing sexual violence, in terms of improving, I would say, improving the kind of experiences of heterosexuality, for women and for men, over the past 50 years, and radically changing that. And so, and those are actually the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about, if we want to go back to the original feminist project around rape, which is this idea very much that a world without rape is possible. And I think that's also something that we lose when the only kind of moral we see to these stories is a punitive one, because it's really an idea that just these things will continue to happen and all we can do is punish them. And we know that our criminal justice system, that punishment doesn't relate to prevention. It doesn't really even relate to individual deterrence, let alone general deterrence. And so when that's the only frame in which we're talking about, the punitive, apart from anything else, it actually ignores this idea that, if we think sexual violence is bound up with cultural norms and practices around sex, then at some level that makes things very daunting, but at another level it actually opens up the possibility that that can change, rather than simply that you can draw the line at a certain point where you punish or where you don't punish.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking when you were talking about the drop-off rate and the low conviction rate, about how that linked to what you'd said earlier about, we need to interrogate assumptions about the empowerment or, beneficial impact of speaking out. This assumption that it will be something that's inherently empowering if you're faced with this, criminal justice system that's very unlikely to give you what you might have expected from it. And it made me think of a question that I wanted to ask you about the reference that you make in your book to silence as well, and the benefits of having a more nuanced relationship with silence, and that neither speaking out nor silence are inherently empowering or disempowering. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things in terms of the kind of politics of speaking out that's in one of the later chapters. But a feminist slogan, a very famous feminist slogan is, break the silence, end the violence. And so, which means, to speak. But what I was interested in was, that it imagines silence as only ever oppressive. And, I spend a lot of time in the book trying to think about, what is the relationship between silence, speech, and harm. And so one of the things that I say is when you actually listen to, this is going to be another very long-winded answer, when you actually, listen to women's stories and narratives about speaking out, often the experience of sexual violence plays a quite small role in the overall story. What's much bigger is, feelings of stigma, of shame, of not having a way to, have harm recognized, responded to, not just with punishment, but even with friends and family and things. And, and so what is overcome when women speak is these kinds of social silences and these social pressures. And, it's this experience of, being silenced. And what I used to think about it is work that Lyotard did around the Holocaust. And, he talks about Holocaust deniers, and he says, what you have there is a particular form of silencing, which is, if people come forward to testify to their harms, Holocaust deniers essentially say, well, you say that there were gas chambers, but where are these eyewitnesses who saw them? If there are no eyewitnesses who saw them, then, they can't be real. Then they say, okay, well, if there are eyewitnesses, you say that these were instruments of genocide, but how did people see them and still live? So if we have, so you set up this impossible situation, and this, I think, is the experience that women face when, they come before the law, and also when they speak socially and in the media, that, it's constantly, you led him on, or, the story doesn't mean what you say it is. So you can speak and not be heard or recognized. And he says, what it is it's like you're speaking a different language. And he says that's what makes a victim. A victim isn't someone who something bad is done to, because that person can become a plaintiff, if they have a space where they can speak and be heard and that harm can be recognized. A victim is someone who is deprived of the ability to speak and have the harm that's done to them recognized. So, if we think about what's harmful in silence is actually being that, that inability to have what you say, your story, your experience be heard, be recognized, be responded to in a just way, then I think, then we can think about silence itself as a very different kind of thing, because then we can think about, telling your story and having it heard and recognized and not having to tell it again, The idea that this experience, could be responded to, with justice, and, that you could reach a point where you no longer feel you have to speak, Or other people have spoken about, there's an author I really like who talked about her experience of being sexually assaulted as a child, and she says it was really important to her to speak, but it was really important to her that before she spoke, she spent many years working through, thinking about the experience, actually thinking about what it meant to her and what she wanted as some kind of resolution for her. And she said, that she was only able in the end to speak about it in the way that she did, and in a way that was useful for her, because she had this period of silence, before. And it relates back to that broader question around, can we imagine a world where, sexual violence isn't the problem that it is now, and that we wouldn't need this project, of speaking out. And this is one of the things that, which we haven't talked about, one of the things I talk about in talking about the campaign around Me Too. And Alyssa Milano, the Hollywood actor who was very involved in kind of sending the first tweet that popularized the campaign, I can't remember the exact time, in the aftermath of the original, kind of tweet going viral, she set up this kind of public campaign called Keep Talking, and it's this idea that, we should keep telling our stories, and, that women just need to speak, and they need to speak again, they need to speak more. And I think, at some level, you can understand that, but at another level, it's kind of this nightmare vision of having to continually reiterate and tell these stories of suffering, and this idea that we'll always have to keep telling these same stories. Whereas Tarana Burke, who was the African-American activist who originally came up with the phrase, and used it in her community organizing, has a very different idea around speech, and she says, we've been talking, and actually we've talked before. And this is another thing that I say in my book, this isn't the first time we've spoken, that there are these outbreaks of speech. And if we only keep speaking, then we're never going to actually do the things that require kind of cultural change. And this is something that another kind of survivor activist said, she became very famous in the late 1980s. She was telling her story of sexual violence. And then several years later, and she thought things were going to change. And then several years later, she reflected back and she said, I now see that I and many other women have been breaking the silence only to have it swallow us back up again. And so I think, again, that comes back to that question of, what is silencing? What is the problem with it? And that there's these different, there's very different ways of being quiet, Yeah. So...
I could listen to you talk all day, but I get to listen to you again very shortly at your presentation. So I'll just ask one more question, which is more about process than substance. And I was thinking, when I was reading your introduction, about how this was your PhD and it became this book that looks a bit different from how it started. And I wondered if we had research students listening, what kind of insights or advice you would share about that process.
Well, I can. I mean, I think to be honest, I'm not necessarily the best person to share advice about process. So I finished my PhD quite a long time ago. And so the book looks very different to the PhD. There's a number of reasons that I didn't publish the PhD straight away. Partly was about the pressures of the job market, and I was working basically supporting myself just teaching, and had a few years where I had very little time to do any kind of research. The other thing was that the PhD was framed very differently. I did my PhD in literature and cultural studies. So the PhD was originally framed around the story of Arabian Nights, and Scheherazade, who is the kind of narrator and heroine of that story, lives in the kind of ancient Persian kingdom, and the Sultan has a wife. Basically, his wife betrays him with a slave, and so after that he decides women can't be trusted, and so he has the wife beheaded, and then I think it's every day, but he marries a new woman, and has sex with her and then beheads her. And so Scheherazade, who is the daughter of the kind of Sultan's advisor, eventually steps forward and says, I'll marry the Sultan, and because she wants to stop things from happening. So what she does is she marries the Sultan, and before they're going to sleep, she tells him a story, but she doesn't finish the story. And so, he says, okay, I'm not going to kill you tomorrow because I want to hear the rest of the story. And she continues to do this for 1001 Nights. And that's where you get the 1001 Nights of stories, which have all kinds of famous stories like Aladdin and his lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. But, what I was interested in was the fact that this is actually a story about rape and sex, because at the end of the story, so after 1001 Nights, he realizes that, he loves her and he wants to properly marry her, and he doesn't want to have the threat of execution hanging over her every night. But she's had 3 children by this point. So, she's been married to this kind of, murderer, and sleeping with him and having sex with him for 1001 Nights. But telling these stories in order to kind of prevent the worst of the violence. So anyway, this is, again, very long-winded. But what I realized after a time is that, I still think that's a really interesting story and a really interesting metaphor, but having the book kind of framed completely around that didn't actually, didn't do what I wanted the book to do, which was, to engage in kind of debates around feminism, sexual violence, because it was called Scheherazade's Daughters, and I say, well, and this is eventually, a friend of mine, a colleague, a more senior colleague, said to me, well, no one who's interested in the debates that you're talking about in your book is going to pick up a title of Scheherazade's Daughters, and no one who picks up that title is going to think that they're going to be looking at, what's in the book. And so that was then a process of thinking, what actually did I want the book to do, and who did I want to speak to, and those kinds of things, which then took, a bit longer in terms of, reframing it. So I suppose, to come back to your question with advice, I think that while it's probably very good to get your PhD published quickly, it's also good to think that they are different documents and they operate in different genres, which is something that I'm quite interested in. And when you publish a PhD as a book, that is a much more, I suppose, it's much more about entering into dialogue. And so it is much more about thinking, you frame the PhD in a way that talks to your examiners, gets you through. But I think then if you want to turn it into, particularly rather than a series of articles, a book, what you hope, I think, is that that's going to enter a set of academic debates and questions. And so it's about really thinking, how do I rework this in a way that puts me into dialogue with the people that I want to be in dialogue with. And it took me a long time to get to that point, even though it seems quite obvious, I suppose. So that would really be the biggest thing that I learned.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanya. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you.
You've been listening to LawPod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle, and LawPod is funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter @QBLawPod. For more information, you can also visit our website, lawpod.org, and please have a look in the show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and this was LawPod.